Alright, this is our second video on the New Deal critics, and this is probably the biggest one, the Supreme Court. If you remember in the New Deal programs, I talked about a couple of them were voided by the Supreme Court, and this angers FDR. He feels that the Supreme Court is a hindrance, and so he does something, or tries to do something. So, Butler versus U.S. and also the Schechter Poultry Company versus the U.S. will void two major programs. Now, the Schechter one was the big one. It was the sick chicken case, okay? Basically, Schechter said that Congress shouldn't have the power to regulate interstate commerce, and it violated separation of powers. The Supreme Court said that the AAA is unconstitutional on the grounds that agriculture is a local, not an interstate matter. In other words, they can't do it. You've got to kind of move on. Now, it had to do with selling sick chickens and not moving them out of rotation, etc. But it voided this big program. And I like to resort it to the fact that if you see somebody and you know this person, and hopefully it's not somebody you know, but I have children, and my children are adorable. But if someone's got an ugly baby, how do you tell that person you have an ugly baby? Because they care so much for it, and you shouldn't do it. It's not right. So FDR has this baby, the New Deal program, and the Supreme Court has basically said, you have an ugly baby. Don't bring it out in public. You're going to scare people. It's going to scar them. So he's upset, and he wants to get some retribution. He wants to make sure they will never again call his baby ugly. Now, the baby that was called ugly here was the NRA, the Blue Eagle. I mean, this was the symbol not only of the NRA, but also of all the New Deal. And now it had to be stripped from all these things because it was unconstitutional. It wasn't American. So FDR came up with a plan. It's called the court packing plan. If it was adopted, it would have given him up to 6 justices on top of the 9 who are already there. FDR's court packing scheme was viewed as attempting to upset traditional separation of powers. They didn't pass this because they saw him as being a dictator. Okay? Despite his popularity, Congress rejected the plan. However, the Supreme Court did stop overturning New Deal legislation. So, if anything, it did work on the fact that, oh my goodness, you're not going to rule it unconstitutional anymore because I've kind of hit the high note, right? Now, the Wagner Act we talked about, set up this idea to collectively bargain for unions. So unions are going to be allowed to go and fight for their rights and not necessarily anything else. Now, West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. They actually ruled in favor of the New Deal. There's Miss Parrish there. She said, I need to have a minimum wage per the Wagner Act. They said no. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said, yes, you have to provide under the Wagner Act the idea for them to collectively bargain. If they want minimum wage, you have to do it. Leads also to the Fair Labor Standards Act and all those things we've already talked about. Now, there's also a union civil war here. The Union Civil War was about labor unions. This guy here, John L. Lewis, is going to create the CIO to combat the AFL. AFL is American Federation of Labor. CIO is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and they fight over which one has the right to decide what's a union, what's not. Now, the big deal here is FDR has to get involved because we're moving close into World War II at this point, and we don't want this happening. Now, unions and a closed shop. There's 3 types of things here. We have an open shop. Membership in a union is voluntary. We have a closed shop, okay? The employer may only hire workers who are already members of the union. Lastly, we have a union shop. You hire whoever, but they must eventually join a union. So know those terms when it comes to union and how things work. Now, one of the big union problems we had here, the UAW, United Auto Workers in Flint, had a sit-down strike. And there's actually, you can see there, a memorial posted this. They sat down on the job of cars trying to get things going on. The police came in. There was a skirmish. Some people were injured. I think some people later died from injuries, if I'm not mistaken there. But there's actually a White Stripes song that refers to this sit-down strike in the 40s, but it's pretty good. Now, lastly, minimum wage. Now, minimum wage is basically your employer cannot go lower than that. They have to have a guaranteed set starting amount for you, and they can't go lower than that. Now, who actually benefits from it? That remains to be seen, because as the minimum wage rises, so does everything else. That's called inflation. Now, that was the second video about the New Deal critics.